Hello and welcome to Why Postliberalism Failed. This is episode 18. I'm James Patterson. With me, as always, is my co-host and co-author Thomas Howes. We have a guest today, H. David Baer. He is a professor of theology at Texas Lutheran University, where he's been since 1999. While he got started writing on or studying ethics at the University of Notre Dame, he then got into the research of Hungarian Lutherans under communism and became very caught up in the discussion of religious freedom because of his expertise in the Hungarian Hungarian Lutheran experience under communism. He became an expert on Hungary, and as a result, with the changing political situation in Hungary, he became a person that people really came to talk about Viktor Orbán and his influence, despite the fact that he also has written a great deal on just war theory. So we're going to talk today about an article he wrote for The Bulwark, came out on September 6, 2024, called The Influence of Austrofascism on J.D. Vance, where many of the ideas buzzing in his ear come from. And I just want to welcome you, Dr. Baer, to the podcast.
Thanks for the invitation. Happy to be here.
Before we get started, I want to remind everyone to like and subscribe. And if you're watching us on YouTube, hit the bell icon. I do this because if I don't, I get very nasty emails from Thomas, all of which I deserve, of course.
And my wife.
Oh!
My wife is always reminding me that we need to do that. So.
It's just abuse transferred over cyberspace.
Yeah.
So, Dr. Baer,
you saved me from my wife, hitting me and stuff. I don't know. She doesn't hit me. I'm just kidding.
Okay, well, we're getting into a whole weird area here now. Dr. Baer, save us and tell us about your article in the Bulwark from a couple months ago.
Well, so this article that I wrote in the Bulwark is about basically the influence of Austrofascism. The title is J.D. Vance, but it's really focused on the what I've really been working on is the influence of Austrofascism on these sort of illiberal Catholics, or most of them are Catholics, a lot of them through Hungary. So the way I got interested in the topic originally is, as you mentioned in your intro, I have this connection to Hungary because I got a degree from the University of Notre Dame, although I'm Lutheran, and my dissertation, which later became a book, was on the Lutheran Church under communism in Hungary. So I sort of I was focusing on all churches under communism, the experience in Hungary, but I was focusing mostly on the Lutheran Church. And obviously my wife's Hungarian, that's how I got interested in Hungary, and we lived in Hungary for a number of years. I had various fellowships Fulbright and some other fellowships that let me stay over in Hungary. So that was in the 1990s, right after the fall of communism, and I was researching basically the history of churches in Hungary under communism. So whatever, I finished that, and then Hungary, I know Hungarian, so I started, whatever. I came back to the States. I got the job I have now at Texas Lutheran, and I'd worked on other projects. And then in 2010, Viktor Orbán came to power, and so I always followed what was going on in Hungary, but just as a person who could, not as a sort of an expert. And then Orban did a lot of, really bad things. One of the things he did was he stripped almost most of the religious communities and churches in Hungary were stripped of their legal status and just sort of sent out into a no man's land. So he basically is massive discrimination against most religious groups in Hungary. So I started researching that. I was critical of it, and I did some more. I went over there. I had a sabbatical and things. I did field work to sort of try to track down what was happening to these communities, these religious groups that had been discriminated against by Orban. A lot of them were shut down, basically. Not all, but many. And so then I became a kind of Hungary critic, okay? Because there really aren't that many people out there in the United States who can talk competently or really as experts about Hungary. You have to know Hungarian pretty much, and I don't know. So whatever, there are like 10 of us that run around and do this. All right, so
it's a challenging language too,
right? It's a hard language. It's Finno-Ugric. I mean, every language is hard, I suppose, when you're first trying to learn it. But anyway, it is hard. It took a long time to learn it. So then Orban, whatever, because I was a critic of Orban. And then the next thing that happens is suddenly I start noticing these all of these American religious conservatives, Rod Dreher is the most prominent, perhaps at least the most well-known, going over to Hungary and talking about how great Hungary is and Orban is. And so I didn't like this since I actually know about Hungary. And so then I started writing criticisms of Hungary, and that's when I started writing for the Bulwark. And so then I just become more, it's sort of become my main, it's just supposed to be a side thing, but it's become my main activity really is talking about Hungary. So then while I'm studying, I'm following all these guys in Hungary, as these religious conservative Americans are going to Hungary, then I started reading various of these Catholic integralists and so forth, and Adrian Vermeule and so forth. And I noticed these weird references, basically what I thought to sort of Austrofascism, or not explicitly, they didn't call it Austrofascism, but some of these figures. So I started researching on that. I'm know German pretty well too, so so I could do that. And so then I started researching Austrofascism, which is what I'm working on now, looking for various connections and influences on American illiberal conservatives. And then that's why I wrote this. Then when J.D. Vance became the vice presidential candidate, I said, well, okay, I'm going to write this article. And so I wrote this article, which is kind of a history of Austrofascism. Well, it's too short, but it's a little overview of Austrofascism. And I try to point out some connections with through some of these people like Vermeule and these other guys, through J.D. Vance, on now, I think, to the Trump administration at some level. So
I like this way of describing the influence that Austrofascism has on Vance. You say that it's not so much that he's necessarily sitting down and reading Austrofascist interpretations of Leo XIII's Catholic social teaching. It's more that he's reading or speaking with or listening to Catholic integralists here in the United States who themselves are, maybe doing that kind of work. It's a bit of a derivative influence. It's not a direct influence, right?
Yeah, I think I don't know what J.D. Vance, specifically what J.D. Vance is reading, but we know he's friends with these people, that these sort of illiberal Catholics, and he's sort of influenced, at least broadly, he moves in this world where these integralists move. And it's kind of odd. There's a lot. This is one of the things that I discovered is this connection. And so a little bit, this is all like not tight argued. This is, there's a kind of soup out there, but there's a lot of connection, it seems, between integralism and Austria, right? So there's this Austrian-American monk, right, Edmund Waldstein, who basically is behind the Josias web page, this integralist web page, and has sort of done a lot to sort of spread, I guess, integralism. And he's a monk from Austria. And then when I was doing research, I saw that he, at least for a time, was on the sort of the board of a society that honors this an apologist for Austrofascism, this guy Johannes Messner, who you see cited in Adrian Vermeule. I mean, I don't think Johannes Messner is a very prominent figure that you would just naturally go read. I mean, I don't know, maybe in some Catholic circles it is, but I never heard of him. But I said, who is this? And so when I started researching it, so there is a kind of connection that runs through, at least Waldstein to this guy Messner. It seems like Vermeule, who cites Waldstein. I know that there's this, Heiligenkreuz.
Sohrab.
Yeah, Sohrab, yeah, Omar, yes, and then right. So there's this Heiligenkreuz is where Waldstein is, and they teach there, and so I don't know what's exactly the situation in Heiligenkreuz. It's a more conservative Catholic sort of education, but there's probably it's probably a spectrum. Maybe Waldstein's on the more conservative side of that spectrum, and then there's another sort of private university in Austria near Heiligenkreuz, where a number of these other integralists have either studied or taught, you guys don't know better than me. The guy, they wrote this book on integralism, Crean, is it Crean?
Crean and Finimister.
Yeah, they both have connections to Austria. So there's a lot of, it's just sort of odd, right? And even the term integralism is kind of odd, because why where does this come from, right? What's the why would you choose this term? And as far as I can see, the term, it seems to come from, it originates in France, right, or probably, or in Spain in the 20th century. Sort of it's a kind of very conservative, anti-democratic, anti-liberal reaction to liberalism in France and maybe in Spain and Portugal and also in Austria. This term integralism itself is kind of a clue, because there were integralists, self-identified integralists in the early 20th century. So I don't think the term goes back further than that. So why would you, if you were just trying to bring back sort of the great Catholic tradition, you wouldn't necessarily call that integralism. Integralism is a kind of an attempt to bring back I guess the medieval or the great Catholic tradition, but in a way that's explicitly anti-modern and anti-liberal. Right. So it has in that regard, it's got some familial relationship to fascism, right? We don't have to use fascism as we don't mean Hitler. We're not using fascism as like just a word for evil, but actually fascism was an intellectual movement that, tried to address certain kinds of social problems. It had, I mean, if you read fascist literature, it's actually kind of interesting. It's like, Marxism, we could say Marxism is evil, but Marxism is also, and socialism was an authentic attempt to respond to social problems. So these were, at the time, they were credible intellectual movements. And, fascism, at least if we set aside Hitler, I think is kind of Nazism is kind of let's separate that version of fascism from what we have in Italy and other countries. And fascism was an attempt kind of to draw on whatever more medieval traditions, right? Political traditions or ideas, and update them for the modern world in a way that would provide some alternative to liberalism on the one hand and communism on the other hand. So it's if you're just an intellectual and you're sitting down and you're reading through these guys, you say, oh, well, it's kind of interesting, because it is kind of interesting. It didn't work out so well in practice, but it's got a kind of history behind it. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I forgot how I got onto this, but anyway.
No, it was good.
Yeah.
So the story of Austrofascism is a short and tragic one. And I just also wanted to point out, in case he's listening to this, our friend of the podcast, Michael Scarence, who is always extremely unhappy with the use of the term
Matthew Scarence.
What's that?
Matthew Scarence.
Matthew's. Oh yeah, did I say Michael? I'm sorry, Matthew. Who's always very unhappy when people use the term Austrofascism, because he says it's a social democrat epithet against Dollfuss, who never uses the term. But regardless, the term stuck. Who was Engelbert Dollfuss, and what was he trying to do? And as a last little thing to throw in there, was he the good fascist?
So Dollfuss is, I mean, there's a little cult, or I don't think there's apparently, I was just in Austria over the summer, and everyone tells me there is no Dollfuss cult in Austria, but there is a kind of Dollfuss cult around certain, Catholics. In fact, there used to be a Dollfuss museum, I guess his house, someone turned his birthplace into a museum, and I wanted to go visit it, but it's been shut down. Anyway, so Dollfuss, what is the truth about Dollfuss? Well, I mean, the short of it is that he was born he seems like he has a kind of compelling biography, because he was an illegitimate child of some peasant woman, and somehow she married somebody else, right? So, and he was only 4 feet tall, or around 4. He was very short, and so he comes from this, I guess, sort of rural or peasant background. He's a kind of disadvantaged because he's an illegitimate child, though he has a stepfather, and he's short. And when the World War I starts, he wants to enroll, and this is the story as I know it. He wants to enroll in the army, and he's too short. But he doesn't, so they won't let him in, and he just tries very hard, and he somehow manages to get himself enlisted in the army. And supposedly he demonstrates a lot of courage as a soldier. I mean, some people, when you read it, he was a foolhardy or whatever, but I mean, he demonstrated some kind of courage as a soldier in the Austro-Hungarian army. Oh, he was also very religious. I think there's no doubt that Dollfuss was very religious, sincerely Catholic person. after World War I, of course, Austria-Hungary collapses, and you get this very small Austrian rump state that has all sorts of problems. And I forget exactly his path. He enters into politics. He's a minister of something.
It's forestry, right?
Yeah, forestry or agriculture. That's what I remember, something like that. And then, but he becomes the chancellor. He must have had some kind of charisma, because he is able to, achieve a high level of success. I think he survives one assassination attempt, and then he's responsible. So Austria-Hungary is after the when Austria is formed after the First World War, it's a liberal democracy. Okay. I can go through the history a little bit more, but Dollfuss is responsible. He's the chancellor there's a sort of gimmick where he shuts down the parliament, or he claims that the parliament has self-eliminated itself. And so then he carries through this transformation of the Austrian constitution from being a explicitly liberal democratic constitution centered around voting and parliamentary system to a corporate system, right? And they change the constitution after Dollfuss does all these things where he shuts down the parliament, he bans parties, he establishes internment camps. I mean, he does things that are clearly authoritarian, just clearly authoritarian. And then he forces all of the parties into one thing called the Fatherland Front. There's a kind of merging of this one organization, the Fatherland Front, with the Austrian state. This merging of state and party is it's common with communism, but it's also characteristic of fascist regimes. And
so it kind of sounds like Aristotle populism a little bit, like the merging or whatever.
Yeah, well, okay, we talk about corporatism. Yes, I mean, we can. So, and then he runs it as he creates this corporate system. Let's talk about corporatism in a second, and then he's assassinated shortly, within, I don't know, 6 months or something, by basically Austrian Nazis or National Socialists. Probably, I don't think it's a fact, but probably instigated by Hitler. So he dies a martyr's death. So, I mean, it's a kind of compelling story, although he was an authoritarian figure, and I don't think Austrofascism, or whatever you want to call it, it wasn't a pretty regime, and it doesn't last very long. So you can say, well, whatever, Austria was in a difficult situation, which it was, but I mean, if you look at what he did in the short time that he was running the country, he basically, we would call what he eliminated trade unions. He eliminated parties. He implemented martial law, or elements of martial law. He sort of controlled the press. He established internment camps. I mean, it's all bad.
Fired artillery into Austrian neighborhoods that were associated
right.
with
there was a little there was civil uprising. So I wouldn't call him a hero, but you could see how someone could. He's a compelling figure, and you could see how somebody who was sincerely religious, Catholic, and you could see how some people would whatever, like, say he's a good guy.
The fact that Austrian Nazis assassinate him is actually a source of great rhetorical kind of riposte for post-liberals, which is how could you call us, Nazis or fascists when they were the ones who killed our favorite guy? And it's a silly thing to say, but I think combine that with the story that you just told about him, this kind of guy coming up from Austrian peasantry and illegitimacy to becoming Austrian chancellor is a pretty impressive story. So
he's closely allied with Mussolini. I mean, everyone agrees that Mussolini is a fascist, right? And at the beginning, Mussolini and Hitler didn't get along. So right. He's very influenced by Mussolini. So so that's the problem with the term fascism, is that it means it's a little hard to define, and it means a lot of different things. And if we think of and it always seems to be Hitler, right? But but okay, so we can agree that there are milder versions of fascism than Hitler's, and but they're still basically fascist because they have certain features that I think we can call something like fascism.
Yeah, well, the conservative revolutionaries in Germany were also fascist and following Mussolini, but they also hated Hitler and the Nazis.
Yeah, right. That's right. Yeah. I mean, what's interesting, I don't know if you want me to, I mean, what's interesting about Austrofascism is the way that it's and Dollfuss is inspired by Quadragesimo Anno, right? I mean, there is, so I think if you look at so Quadragesimo Anno, I suppose the people who listen to this will know, is this social encyclical, Pius XI. It was in 1931. It's on the 40th anniversary of Rerum Novarum. So it's in this tradition of, it's starting the early parts of this tradition of the Catholic social teaching. And if you read Rerum Novarum, if you read Quadragesimo Anno, it introduces the Pius XI there really comes out in favor of this idea of corporatism. So this idea of what we call corporatism was very, very common in a common topic or theme of, I don't know, debate or discourse among conservatives in Europe in the late 19th, early 20th century. So it was, and there are a lot of different corporatists. Or it's not like one. It's like just a Catholic thing. Mussolini has elements of corporatism. There are various. Not everyone who talked about corporatism was a Catholic, right? But it was a conservative idea, and the idea was that we don't like liberalism because liberalism. Because liberalism emphasized the individual too much. And it also basically the liberalism is also eroding certain privileges of the Catholic Church. So we got these things we don't like liberalism. We obviously don't like communism or socialism and communism because it's explicitly anti-religious. But socialism and communism tries to address the social question, which is a real question. So we need some alternative. And the idea of corporatism, which is among these conservatives, is supposed to be different from liberalism and different from socialism. It's a kind of third way. And I think broadly the idea is, well, we should look to the Middle Ages. And in the Middle Ages, you had guilds. And these guilds were like trade organizations or whatever. And these guilds were better than trade unions because they weren't built on sort of the class conflict. So the guilds, you didn't have like, labor and management and opposition. You sort of had them working together in harmony. And we organize people around these guilds so there's more social harmony. And then we take all these corporations or guilds and we build them up in a hierarchical structure, guided by the state. And you have a harmonious society where everybody has a place in society and they're not isolated, atomized individuals, but they're also not, socialists. And so that's the idea. And it's clear roughly. And it's clear that lots of people are talking about this, and if you read Quadragesimo Anno, it's clear that the Pope endorses corporatism in some form. And what we know about, the history of the way this encyclical is written is quite interesting. So the encyclical had this ghostwriter, right? He was a German ghostwriter, his Latin Nell Breuning, I think Oswald von Nell Breuning. Okay, and he apparently wrote almost the whole thing. And he's got an account of what happens because Quadragesimo Anno when it comes out. Well, okay. So Nell Breuning, I'll go back. He writes this basically the whole thing. He sends a draft off. We know this from his own account. He sends a draft off to the Pope, Pius XI. I guess they like it, but the Pope inserts, or he has written like 4 or 5 paragraphs, which become, I think, paragraphs 91 through 96, I can't remember exactly in Quadragesimo Anno, but a certain set of paragraphs, and he wants these paragraphs inserted somewhere in Quadragesimo Anno. So Nell Breuning, he puts it in, and these paragraphs that the Pope wrote seem to be written with Italy in mind, and they seem to be kind of an endorsement of corporatism in Italian fascism, with some qualifications, but it's basically seen as a kind of an endorsement of Italian fascism. And in Austria, it was interpreted, these passages or this section of the encyclical was interpreted. People thought for a long time that the encyclical was influenced, because there's always guessing who influenced it, by this Austrian priest, politician, chancellor, this Ignaz Seipel, who was an important figure in Austria. And they said, oh, well, this is Seipel's influence. Or there was another guy an important guy who wrote about corporatism in Austria, this guy Vogelsang, and they said, oh, this is these guys. And Nell Breuning says, no, these guys had no influence. And as far as I know, this is true based on later research. It was basically Nell Breuning, and he was influenced by another German guy named Gundach, right? And okay, so it wasn't, and this has been misinterpreted, he says. So, you know, I think that I'm sure that this account is essentially correct, but I guess my thought is that my thought is that corporatism is like it's like a soup, or I mean, it's like it's a general theme. And if you read, I've read a little, all of this stuff is in German. I can't, I don't feel, I'm not an expert, but I've read Vogelsang, I've read Gundach, I've read all these people. And, whatever, Vogelsang is like kind of an interesting essayist, and Gundach is like an academic. And they're probably not the same, but it's kind of the same thing. It's roughly the same thing. You have to look really carefully and study their thought really, or Messner, to know, well, they disagree on this and that. I mean, they disagree, they're arguing with each other, but it's not so different. It's all part of the same worldview, or the same sort of theme of corporatism. So it's totally understandable that the encyclical would be interpreted as endorsing this idea of corporatism, and the distinction between Vogelsang and Gundach, whatever, is not that important, at least as it be understood by a common person. And then the encyclical did lend a lot of support to the idea of corporatism. I mean, it affected Austria. Austria tries to build itself on the model of Quadrigesso Anno. It has influence in Hungary, and it has influence all over. So, so the encyclical has a big impact, and it's interpreted at the time as endorsing sort of what we could call not the fascism that we have in Nazism, but maybe clerical fascism, or if we want to don't want to use the term fascism, we could just call it corporatism.
So, far outstripping his influence and memory in Austria, it would seem, Dollfuss really has a major influence on contemporary American sort of illiberal Catholics. I had to laugh because when you were talking about Waldstein, there's the Austrians had no idea who he is either.
Right, that's right.
Yeah, and in fact, a journalist named Ava Concet at Falter contacted me about him. I think you also, at least you know her.
I met her when I was doing the research in Hungary and Austria, and she didn't know anything about it, and I think I told her to get in touch with you.
I knew there was some sort of connection. She and I talked about it. I couldn't believe it, and but I guess it just makes sense that just because he lives there doesn't necessarily mean that they pay much attention to him. So like why is it that these ideas have made such an impact, aside from the biography, right, which we did talk about? Like, what is it about medieval guilds that appeals to sort of 21st century American illiberal like Adrian Vermeule, that is?
Well, okay, so this is somewhat speculative, right? I think that if you are unhappy with liberalism, okay, you're unhappy with liberalism maybe because you don't like the direction that the culture has gone. Okay, I think a lot of these guys are unhappy with the culture. You're unhappy with liberalism because it seems to be totally accompanied with secularization. So maybe they're reducing the loss of religious influence. Then you might want to look for alternatives, okay? And if you look at what's out there, you don't like things about liberalism, and so you reject liberalism in general. You don't like the culture war stuff. You're somehow unhappy, okay, with the world. And you may also be, I think a lot of these guys are converts, okay? And I think if you looked at almost all these guys have converted to Catholicism, and they've written about it, right? They described they describe their conversion. So you kind of have, if you wanted to do a study, let's do a study of the conversion narratives of whatever, Amari and Vermeule and whatever, or J.D. Vance. And we could compare those with conversion narratives from, whatever, the 18th century, something like this. And if you look at I'm not trying to if you look at their conversion narratives, or you look at the stories they tell about what attracted them to Catholicism, I think, this would be my reading, that one of the things that attracts them to it is this sense of certainty and the idea of truth, right? So we live in very, very unclear times. There's a lot of change, there's a lot of upheaval. It's very easy to sort of be disoriented. I mean, since we are all disoriented, and what appeals, I would say, that you read their conversion stories or their accounts of their conversion, they're attracted to the idea of truth and certainty and the solidness of the Catholic tradition. Okay, if you read a conversion narrative, if you read John Wesley's conversion narrative, okay, it wouldn't be about certainty. It would be, his heart extremely warm because he's realized his sinfulness, or it might have a more of an individual, or the trials and tribulations, and you felt, Jesus protecting you, or you'd have a different kind of theme, right? And the theme of certainty and sort of a rock of certainty in the sea of uncertainty that is our world. I think that's that's just speculative, and I don't want to diminish the authenticity of somebody's faith or anything, but I think what clearly some element of what is the attraction is the certainty. There's a so Peter Berger, Peter Berger was this. I should have pulled this up. This quote. I wonder if I could find it. If I known I was. Peter Berger wrote a book, An Invitation to Sociology, in the 1960s. Okay, it's a short little book. It's actually really interesting. And there's a part of that book where he talks about, and this is in 1961, or I don't know when it is, in the 1960s, how what he's got this theme about people choose their identities, or identity is more of a question. And with all the change, what does it mean to be a father? What does it mean to be a mother? What does it mean to be which religion should I belong to, and so forth? There's this question of identity, and he said, he's writing, that it's really not surprising that in this kind of atmosphere you would find both Marxism, of course, Marxism was still a live option in the 60s. Both Marxism and Catholicism have a kind of attraction because they both are comprehensive worldviews. They give a kind of complete picture. This is the attraction of Catholicism, is that it's a large tradition. At least I think the attraction for an intellectual. It's a large tradition with a long history, lots of important intellectuals that gives you a kind of view of the world, a very kind of complete view of the world. Yeah. Go ahead.
Oh, but I have noticed, I just want to interject a little bit with
sure.
A Catholic perspective. That seems to be you're getting at a big divide too between sort of the Orthodox Catholics who are more supportive of Second Vatican Council and the new theology. People like Benedict XVI tend to be the emphasis on Catholicism not being a closed system. But the traditionalists want it to be a closed system, so they want it to be able to pull up the book of it's called Denzinger. It's the book that lists all the history of dogmas, and they want that plus the Summa, and then when you combine those two books, we can deduce exactly what is the truth about everything.
Well, right? I don't want to get involved in the Catholic, but I think the part of the
but also
of the Catholics to
history itself. Normally, the sort of new theology, Second Vatican Council types will understand history itself as a source of theology, that we have to understand ourselves through history. And they don't like that because they want it all to be condensed into this logical system of deduction.
Yeah, that's my. I'm Lutheran, so obviously Lutherans like we have a.
No, I thought you had a good point.
But we Lutherans,
here you stand. You can do no other.
Yeah. So I'm going to have a different perspective, but I do think that my impression of Thomism. So I'm sorry that. Or at least I should say of Thomists, modern Thomists. Is that they're sort of they're always appealing to Aristotle and stuff. It's very deductive, right? You want to put together all the pieces of your system. You got your theories about how causes and everything goes together, and you got a nice hierarchy, and then everything just follows from this, right? And it's so in this sense, it's very deductive. It's like you have a blueprint for society that you want to actualize. And in this respect, it is like Marxism, okay? That there's a blueprint for, it's a different theory of whatever drives the world forward, but you got a preconceived concept, okay? And that you want to realize, and you want to implement it, and there's a similarity there. And I think my own view, I find this corporatist, this 20th century fascism interesting, but my personal view of it is that it's a very deductive. It's got the same it's a version of Catholicism that's very deductive. You come up, you construct an ideal picture of society. You say, it comes from the Middle Ages, and you may have pulled a few things out of the Middle Ages. You say, well, it came from the Middle Ages, and in the Middle Ages that was the ideal because everything functioned according to natural law. And the natural law was what was in the Middle Ages, and we just have to apply that today. And I mean, so it's an ideology. I mean, it's an ideology, and in that respect, in my opinion, it's like communism. So, of course, it's different in other ways, but in this deductive, and so okay, so that's that. I think, I mean, there's probably more you could say sympathetic things about it, but to me, that's like the fundamental truth. Liberalism is basically, as I understand it, is basically a political system that's concerned with sort of issues of power and regulating power and protecting. You're trying to limit power. It's concerned largely with constitutional organization and structure and limiting power. And it doesn't really have a worldview. I mean, other than we're going to try to, it leaves a kind of empty worldview. And the idea is, in a liberal society, you sort of figure out what you adopt a worldview within this system, this set of rules, right, that are designed to make sure everybody has a place or whatever, and regulate power. So liberalism is not attractive as a life philosophy, because it's just a set of ground rules for how we will organize society, which is attentive to issues of power and the potential for abuse of power and the limits of knowledge. So it's kind of a system for people who you're like constantly uncertain. I have to go back. If you read like Reinhold Niebuhr, right, giving his justification of liberalism, it's like, well, you live in this, you don't really know. You're in this, you have to have humility, and toleration is a lack of, we don't really know anything. And it's kind of messy and uncertain, and these other systems are more comprehensive, so they're more attractive. And then at least they're more attractive, especially to intellectuals, because as an intellectual, you want to have a worldview. So I think that's the attraction. Plus, people then they're unhappy because whatever, the various liberal cultural issues. And so if you go look in the tradition, you can go back and read Thomas Aquinas in the medieval stuff, but you don't really have a model there for the modern world, right? I mean, that's just sort of so far ago. So if you want to look for a model for the modern world, you got to look to something more recent. You can look to corporatism, right, which at least is a modern version or translation of Catholicism into the modern world, dealing with similar kinds of problems that we're dealing with. And you say, that's the solution. I mean, what are the options that are on the table there that in terms of comprehensivism? You can be some version of a socialist Marxist. That's kind of lost favor, but that's one of the options. You could be a liberal, all right, or you could be a corporatist. I mean, these are the three kind of or a fascist, if you want to use the term. I mean, these are kind of the options that are on the table for visions of our society, and so they go for that. They go for the corporatism. Anyway, that would be maybe I'm wrong, but that would be my rough take.
Okay.
So
it's very insightful. I mean, I think you are getting at something. You definitely are dealing with a lot of the people, at least the biggest people in this integralism movement and postliberalism movement are kind of, have traits of ideologues, right? That they're ideological and very closed world that they have to work with, or whatever. And I think you're right that they find some comfort and certainty in that kind of closed worldview. Yeah, no, I mean, I can say that as a Catholic, because I see it. I mean, that's one of the tensions I have with the more traditionalist part of it. Yeah.
I mean, it's the same thing with, okay, now we're talking about Catholic. Sorry, I'm Lutheran soon. You guys don't have to listen to me. But, it's the same, frankly, in my opinion, if you look at Aristotle, okay, and the way that Aristotle is used. So, there's always, Aristotle's got this reputation as being, very empirical, and we're going to look at experience, and if you think of the famous painting of the School of Athens by Raphael and the whatever in the Vatican, and there's Plato pointing up because he's off in the sky and the heavens, and there's Aristotle pointing down because he's more down to earth, right? And it's true if you got the Plato's theory of the forms, and that's really out there, and Aristotle is more down to earth, I suppose, than Plato. But I mean, Aristotle is not an empiricist in any sense that we use the term empiricist. I mean, he wasn't a data guy, right? He wasn't doing social science, or he was a philosopher, right? And if you look at the kinds of arguments that he makes, they aren't especially empirical. They're just a different version. I mean, that's my view. So, Aristotle's view of society, right? You read the Politics, and he's got this account, right, which says, well, how do we get the city-state, which is, well, first the man and woman come together, and the man and woman are, household, and then the households come together and you get a village, and then the villages come together and you get the state, and that's it. And so there's like this building up. Is that really true? If you looked at the history of that sort of account follows from his sort of theory of potentiality and actuality and his understanding of human nature or things moving towards completion. This would be my theory. It's sort of predetermined by his metaphysics, right? If you went and you did, and I'm not blaming Aristotle, he lived, whatever it was, 2000 or, a long time ago, right? But if you went out and did a study, I don't think you'd find, and that's the way we get states. I think you'd find that, whatever. I think Max Weber talks about war. I mean, war is an important element and forming societies and states, and this idea of a perfect society building up. It's philosophically determined, right? It's not really an empirical observation. It's the same, and so these Aristotelian arguments about the origins of society are, in my opinion, as fanciful as what they say about the social contract. I mean, there never was a social contract. Well, you're right, there wasn't, and there never was these sort of like things coming together in this Aristotelian way. Now I'm off on a tangent. Oh yeah, so this is the way I teach. Also, I just go on tangents. So so if you look at corporatism, it's also a model. It is a kind of Aristotelian model, and in the Aristotle model, you got the household, or you got the household and the village, then the city, and everything's a part of a greater whole. You're all part, and it's all pieces of a puzzle that sort of make a triangle or a hierarchy. And that's the way corporatism is supposed to work. You got your various corporations and guilds; they all come together, and it makes sense because the one leads to another, and you're going up towards this, fulfillment, this Aristotelian telos, right? But that's just a theory, right? It's not an empirical theory. It's an Aristotelian theory based on an Aristotelian metaphysic that, isn't true. So, it doesn't have any basis in what we know about, empirical science today. So it's just a philosophy. It's so corporatism is also, in my opinion, very deductive. And these kinds, on the other hand,
it's also based on a very nostalgic view of how medieval guilds were.
It's also built on medievalness. It's true. Yeah, it's built.
In fact, I've actually, as part of our book, we have a chapter having a little bit takedown on corporatism, and what really helpful was the largest thing I've ever found of study of medieval guilds was by Shelley Ogilvie of Oxford, and she just goes through all the empirical record, and basically there's all this romanticism about them, but they were really extractive. You talk about special interest problems, like it's really extractive institutions, aimed at benefiting the people in the guild at the expense of everybody outside of the guild, right? So
I'm totally against the corporatists, but if we wanted to we wanted to go the other side and say, okay, but let's think about it, okay, especially in the 19th century, the early 20th century. It wasn't as if there were no social problems, right?
Yeah.
It wasn't as if there weren't any political issues that people were trying to solve, and one of them was, connected with industrialization, and we still have elements of this, and you have poverty, and you have urban poverty, and you have sort of fragmentation and atomization of societies. These are real problems, and corporatist philosophy was trying to address that. It wasn't just, we want to create our little Catholic society where we get to call all the shots. It was also a response to it was an authentic response, let's say, to real social issues. They were looking for solutions. And if we want to know is there anything sort of authentic in contemporary integralism? I actually think when you read integralists and you read, say, early 20th century corporatists, modern integralists are just not nearly as deep a thinker. They're shallow. They're not interesting thinkers. It's kind of derivative. It doesn't have the vitality. It doesn't have the level of authenticity. These are just sort of subjective judgments of, say, these guys that are writing in the early 20th century. So in some ways, it's just derivative. But on the other hand, so it's not really a very powerful philosophy that's really trying to solve problems. But we do have problems today too. We do have problems with atomization. We do have problems with the erosion. It's something connected with modernity and the pace of change, which erodes, which isolates people, which atomizes people, which erodes the social fabric that we basically need to have to be happy people, right? So it isn't as if there aren't any real problems, and liberalism really probably isn't suited if I'm right, liberalism is basically an argument about how to sort of balance power and create ground rules. Liberalism by itself is probably not suited to provide answers to these problems. So, you know, there's plenty of serious intellectual work that would need to be done to think about these problems, but they aren't really serious philosophers. They mostly just want to tear things up.
Yeah, that's right. They're radicals. They want to tear things down. And you brought up Vermeulen. Let's just go back a little bit. You brought up Vermeulen and the influence of this Austrofascist author on his especially his interpretation. What's his name?
Here it is. Here, well, I don't know if Vermeulen reads this. Is okay. I got it right here.
His name's Messner, right?
Yeah, Metzner. Yeah,
and he had a very particular Messner had a very particular sort of heterodox interpretation of the principle of subsidiarity, didn't he?
Okay. Well, I don't know if it's heterodox. Okay, I don't know what the so I actually think Vermeulen's got a little bit more of an argument than on this one than so okay, but
well, just as a background.
So what's the issue here?
I just want to give a little background. The principle of subsidiarity was based off of it
comes out of quadragesimal anno. Okay.
So no, it doesn't. It doesn't.
No. Okay. Where does it come?
The term comes from quadragesimal anno, but it was a translation of a principle called the principle of hypotaxis, which you see subsidiarity comes from hypotaxis, and it goes back to a Italian social thomist named Tapparelli from the middle of the 19th century.
So I don't know this.
He had a bunch of influence on people, like he was a teacher of Leo XIII, and he had a bunch of influence on that. And it's my understanding of Tapparelli, just based on is that it doesn't have the same connotation as it has in Messner, but I don't know.
All right, so here's the issue with subsidiarity. Okay, possibly the most possibly the most overrated concept in overrated concept in Catholic social theory, because it doesn't really answer very much. It doesn't answer. I want to take this. So the idea of subsidiarity is sort of broadly is, as I understand it, as it's in quadragesimal anno and whatever, but whatever it comes from. You guys correct me if I'm wrong. Is that okay? We want to have society consists of social units or subsidiary bodies, and we want these bodies to be these little social groups to be relatively autonomous. We want them to do their own thing. We want the administration of these activities to be sort of designated lower down with the bodies, right? And then for whatever reason, when they aren't able to do it, we go up to a higher body. Okay, we go. So we really want to delegate. Well, we either want to delegate or we want to locate decision making in these lower bodies. Okay. So if you have a liberal understanding of subsidiarity, well, that's the basic idea of subsidiarity. And then the question becomes, under what conditions do you intervene? Okay. From the top. Okay. And if you have a liberal understanding of subsidiarity, then you would say, well, these bodies, these local groups, whatever, the family, the city, that they're going to be autonomous. We're going to let them decide themselves because there's more freedom. There's more variety, and we're only going to interfere if for some reason they're unable to address a problem that is higher up, right? I don't know. So like the best example of this is like the environment, right? So you say we let everybody take care of regulate their own water or something, right? Like Texas and New Mexico are going to try to regulate how they use the Rio Grande River, but they may not agree because, and so when there's a conflict, we got to have some higher body that will resolve the disagreement, right? So we only kick it up when to a higher authority when we're unable to, the lower bodies are just unable to resolve it, right? So that's a kind of liberal understanding of subsidiary, which is maybe the dominant one. But another way to understand a subsidiarity is to say, well, we want an organized society, right? We want the bodies to do their tasks. Okay, but when they fail to do their tasks, right, then we've got to intervene so that they will correctly do their tasks. So the question, so in other words, the superior body, whatever the authority, the supreme authority, says, okay, we need to intervene. This would be Vermeulen's understanding, I think. We need to intervene because it's a kind of normative understanding, right? It's not like, oh, we have a problem we can't fix. It's that we have a normative concept of what they're supposed to do. Sort of like the way the parents make sure the kids are doing their homework. Okay. And if they don't do the homework, then the parent's going to say, you better do your homework. Okay. And as far as I can see, when I first read Vermeulen, I said, this is insane, what he's saying. Okay. This is crazy. And the Messner has this what I would call an authoritarian understanding of sort of top-down understanding of subsidiarity, where you intervene for normative reasons, which is basically Vermeule's understanding. But if you just look at the concept, you could interpret it either way. I mean, it doesn't. The idea that we want lower bodies to be autonomous or not to be self-administering, let's say, begs the question: under what conditions do you interfere? Do you interfere for normative reasons when they fail to do what they're morally supposed to do, or do you interfere because freedom is we can't adjudicate the conflicts?
But you say it raises the question, but I don't think it was ever intended to give that much information. It's just supposed to be a reminder that this is a concern. And then you'd have to make a separate argument for why, that this level needs its own autonomy.
You might say I'm in favor of the liberal version of subsidiarity for these X, Y, and Z. That's what I would argue for X, Y, and Z reasons, right?
But I do think since generally the church and the way that things have been presented since those times, it's generally favored the more like protection of the bottom interpretation.
Well, maybe you're right, because sorry, I'm interrupting you.
Like if you read like the catechism, or you read, if you read the other, church documents, after the council, the emphasis has always been on it being a principle that sort of protects the autonomy of lower levels of organization or individual level.
But maybe in its origins it was more ambiguous. Is that?
Well, I think it's more ambiguous.
It's more ambiguous in that when it first appears as subsidiarity. But it was derived from this principle of hypotaxis, and it's in the writings of Taparelli. And I do think it has that sort of emphasis on like not overwhelming the autonomy of lower levels of through social action. But
so Dr. Baer, what relationship do you think these folks and they're it's essentially sort of like mediocre ressourcement?
It's kind of a mediocre, second tier, second string.
To what extent or what relationship do they have with Orban? It's so weird that you have Gladden Papin writing in American Affairs about corporatism, and he's also the Hungarian Institute of International Affairs president.
Foreign policy. I think he's the president of the Hungarian Institute for. So he basically is on Orban's payroll. I don't know exactly. Yeah, right. Yeah, I mean, literally, he's literally paid by Viktor Orban.
It's not that let the audience know this is not like figurative language. He is paid directly by the
it's literally the case, so that when he writes something, I mean, it's kind of like you're a foreign lobbyist, right? So I think it's a sort of separate story. Orban basically went authoritarian in 2010 when he came into power, and he worked very hard to market himself in the United States. And he didn't have much success at the beginning. Okay. Then you had 2014, 2015, you had this great, immigration crisis in Europe. And when you had this immigration crisis, then Orban found, he found a hold on, and he started getting sympathy in Western Europe among conservatives, or in the West, in America too. Then he started spending just unbelievable amounts of money running think tanks, funding think tanks, inviting people to Hungary, conservatives, and he had these success with these American conservatives that come into this place, like the Danube Institute or this other place, MCC. Hold on one second. Someone's knocking at my door. Sorry.
Oh, right on.
Sorry to interrupt. You have to go back. So the heat is on. It's like boiling in this room, and they're trying to fix it because we're in. Anyway, so let me get back. So I'll back up a little bit. What was
you were talking about Danube and MCC.
So Orban spends a lot of money on these funding these think tanks like the Danube Institute and MCC, and giving very generous fellowships to Americans or Western European conservatives to come and have research. I mean, it's a really good gig. I think these MCC fellowships, at least based on the webpage, I mean, it's like $10,000 a month, and that doesn't include your housing and your expenses. Just $10,000. I mean, so that's quite a lot of money if you're a professor. So he's spending a lot of money. And then this has worked, okay? It's worked in bringing in these people. He's established these connections, mostly with these, with a lot of them with these American illiberal Catholics. And so Gladden Pappin is there, and then Patrick Deneen has been over there a lot. So it's basically just an influence. I think it's just really an influence campaign that has worked pretty well. And then there's a lot of flowing back and forth of ideas right now. And now the Danube Institute has some sort of a formal relationship with the
Heritage,
right, with Heritage Foundation. And so there's a lot of exchanging of information, and it's an enormous amount of money. I think the money that the endowment that Orban gave the MCC is like $1.7 billion. I mean, it's more money than they spend on the rest of Hungarian education.
wow.
So it's an influence campaign. If you look at Orban, I always said that people always say Orban is fascist, and I said Orban is not fascist. It's a kind of I've gotten more open to the argument about fascism than I was when I first started out. If you look at Orban's rhetoric, all right, it shows the influence of fascist thinking, right? When he gives one of his big programmatic speeches, you find, he talks about the role of work. It sounds very like the work. He talked once about building the workfare state, sounded like fascism, or not Hitler, but the other kinds of the lighter fascism. A lot of the rhetoric is kind of fascist. I don't know who he's reading, okay, or who his advisors are reading, or where he gets his ideas. So the rhetoric is fascist, but it's not really. And he's funding these guys who are talking to integralists and so forth. It's not really fascist though, because it's missing some of the features. Well, it's got some of the features and missing some of the other features of fascism.
Would you say he's a soft authoritarian?
I think I would call it an authoritarian regime, absolutely.
Just authoritarian regime.
But okay, so what is it? One of the things that characterizes fascism is emerging, and it's not just fascism, it was communism too, is emerging of the state and the party. Okay, well, you definitely have that in Hungary. So the state and Orban's party, Fidesz, are totally intertwined, and also lots and lots of the social institutions, education, everything is sort of intertwined with the party and the state. So in this respect, it's like fascism. But you also have lots of parties in Hungary that compete under very, very unfair conditions, which you don't. And fascists usually try to eliminate parties, right? They only want one party. You can't have parties because that's against the unity of the people. You certainly have more freedom of the press and freedom of the speech and so forth in Hungary than you did in say Dollfuss's regime. And there aren't internment camps, okay, in Hungary, that at least not that I know of, right? So it's a kind of authoritarian regime. People call it a hybrid regime. I don't know, but his rhetoric is fascist. I think his rhetoric is fascist, and the ideology he uses to try to explain what he's doing draws on fascist ideas.
Now, do you see any connection with, because you know how the Heritage Foundation crowd is trying to with some of the things that the efforts that they've had recently with the idea of like firing civil servants and replacing them with loyalists, all of that, or trying to break through like unwritten sort of norms of governance that aren't technically illegal to break, so that they can install have more power. Is that a kind of an Orban playbook, or is there any connection there? Or
okay, so Urbanization, you hear this term Urbanization, and it's not just liberals who use the term Urbanization. I mean, I try to follow a lot of the European, mostly the German-speaking right wing, like AfD or AfD in Germany and Austria too. And Urbanization is something they talk about, right? So there's this very right-wing guy in Austria, Martin Sellner. I mean, he's just a identitarian. He's a really right-wing guy, influencer. He's got a book, Regime Change from the Right, and he's got a whole section on Urbanization in there, right? He's written about. I often read the sort of magazine for Germany's AfD right-wing party, which is called Compact. It's got the same name as the party. Literally, I mean,
you said regime change and then Compact. I'm like, are they just copying these people?
You wonder. No, you really have to wonder. I mean, because it's so coincidental. Okay, but so I read the German Compact. Right, and they'll write about regime. They'll write about Urbanization there too. It's a strategy Okay, so what is the they look into Orban and they say, oh, we can repeat what he did. Of course, it's not like a secret. It's not like some secret sauce. I mean, anybody can look and see what Orban did. But one of the things that is an essential part of the strategy of Orbanization, as the people who want to do it understand it, is that when Orban came to power in 2010, he didn't tell anybody he was going to change the constitution. He didn't run on regime change, okay? But when he came in, he had a supermajority, so he'd get away with whatever he wanted, and he immediately did all sorts. Well, within a year, he did all sorts of he changed the whole structure, the constitutional structure. He changed the criminal code. I mean, he did radical changes, and he did it so quick. He replaced judges and stuff that everybody was like, oh, they were caught off guard. They were caught on their heels, and they couldn't stop it. I mean, partly because he had enough power to do it, but partly because they weren't ready. And once you create, so the first step of Orbanization is you implement very radical changes very quick while you have the political capital before your enemies or opponents are organized. The next thing is you have to stay in power. And you have to mobilize and look for ways to, I mean, these radical rapid changes won't work if you can't maintain your hold on power. So, and the strategy of Urbanization is supposed to build mass movements and mass support and so forth. And to some extent, Orban was brought in by popular support, but he also sort of garnered it up once he mobilized people once he was in power. So this element of Urbanization, where you do really quick changes that are and you can challenge him in the courts, but it takes a while for the courts to decide, and you just sort of produce facts on the ground, and it's too late. Orban often lost. In the beginning, he lost his court cases. He lost them in Brussels. Or in Strasbourg. He lost them even with his own constitutional court. Didn't really care because there were facts on the ground. He kind of ignored it, and he just kept pushing the envelope. So, I haven't read the whole. I mean, I looked at that project 2025, but it's like so long and boring that I just rather read the synopsis of it. So I don't know everything.
What's wrong with this?
Yeah, it's just painful. I mean, it's just so, geez. So, but this is what you hear, and I think that Trump will try to do this, right? I mean, with the Schedule F and putting in these wackos in these. So he wants to just sort of flush out the civil service, or this, he wants to produce radical changes. That is a kind of Urbanization strategy, and he wants to if you put these crazy people at the top of these, Matthew Gaetz at the top of what is the position Matthew Gaetz is?
Attorney General.
Attorney General, right? Then everyone's going to resign, and I mean so that's all part of trying to take over the institutions. Is that no doubt about it? Of course. So I think that
this is terrifying. By the way, this is actually making me really scared now.
But the thing is, in order for it to, I mean, it causes damage. But in order to succeed, you have to stay in power for a long time, right? So you can't, I mean, you can cause a lot of damage and so forth, but it's also the success of it is premised on sustained power holding. Like even in Poland, I don't know as much about Poland, but they tried to copy Orban, but they couldn't stay, they got voted out eventually. I think it was after 8 years or something, right? Orban has so successfully manipulated the system that although now he has some challenges, it's very hard to, really removing Orban from power means toppling a regime at this point. Okay, it's not just switching governments. And in Poland, they weren't able to go that far because they didn't maybe have as much control, and because they just couldn't stay in power. So, I don't know how it works out, but if you establish a precedent where you just go in and fire all the civil servants, well, the next president will do the same thing, right? What that means in the long run is you just don't have a very good civil service, right? I mean that's damaging to. You look at countries where the whole state bureaucracy is political rather than sort of non-political, they don't run as well. They're not as efficient. It's not a good way to run a country. But unless you can stay in power for a very long time, I mean, someone can reverse it. So. So they look at this strategy of Urbanization, which is about using the levers of power to force change very radically while everyone else is sort of like either doesn't have power or is not yet organized. And I do think you do see them. My guess is they've noticed that Orban has done that and they want to try something similar. But it takes more than that for it to succeed. You got to stay in power.
I know this is a bit of a. I don't want to be one of those guys, right? Like who's constantly saying fascism, but it is funny that you're talking about Urbanization, considering that is how a lot of right-wing parties operated in the success of Mussolini. They wanted to emulate Mussolini's effort, and Mussolini actually assisted in this, right down to, Dollfuss was incorporating a lot of Mussolini's efforts. You have Pavlich in Croatia, and the Latin American countries were big fans. You had both, I'm trying to remember his name, Salgado from Brazil actually visited Mussolini.
Yeah.
And it's a bit wild how there's this effort to kind of export this regime as a way of almost, is it gaining legitimacy? Why do people want to emulate this if it's not going to produce good results?
Well, I mean, we're speculating again. I think that there's
That's
a lot
okay.
of people.
That's
There's
okay.
a lot of people who, a lot of people. I think these sort of the liberal intellectual Catholics who support Trump and so forth is because they just want to tear things down. So I think there's a lot of impulse, a lot of and widespread. I mean, I don't know how widespread, but it's not it is a widespread feeling that everything is broken and we just need to blow things up and start over. And I think that part of what motivates these conservative religious supporters of Trump is this idea that not that they really admire Trump, but they think that he's an agent of destruction. And if he can tear things down, then we can replace it with something that we like better. And so that's what that's how I would and Orban basically has been able to completely carry out a social transformation of Hungary. He's in the time that he's been in power by acting very aggressively, pulling the levers of power, and then holding on to power and stamping out the opposition. I'm not really. I think it's not going to be that easy to if they really want to do a full Urbanization, it's going to be pretty hard to do that in the United States. But you can certainly cause a lot of havoc and destruction and harm, I would say. So
yeah, as soon as you said that, I rolled over to my bookshelf to find the book that Deneen published right before Why Liberalism Failed. I cannot find it, and it's going to drive me crazy. But I wrote a review of it for the journal Society, in which he says more or less what you just described, that the United States as a nation had a corrupt or faulty founding, and that it needs to be refounded without its liberalism. So
yeah, and that's also very deductive. It's like except it's vague. We got a better idea of how things should be. Let's blow it all up, and we'll create a new society. I mean, that's a program. That's a revolutionary program. It's like, let's redesign society. And it never works out the way people think it'll work out. It's just not. It's not a prudent course of action.
Yeah, it takes a lot of work to make things, build up things. Just tearing them down, then you have to start from scratch. And
there's a lot of things you're not in control of, and there are a lot of people who aren't going to go with what I mean, I don't want to. Usually, if you look at another way to think about the corporatism in the early 20th century is that in many ways there are a lot of social changes, right, going on. Whatever, there's social upheaval connected with industrialization, but also social changes connected with liberalism, which is changing structure of society, changing moral values, and all these things were basically bad for most churches, for the Catholic Church, but for all the churches, which were in some ways, they were in better position in the ancient regime, right? And all of these changes of modernity have costs. There are costs. The churches are coming out as losers in these changes, right? They're losing things to some extent, okay? At least, and it's a kind of reaction, right? Well, we don't like what's happening. We don't like society getting more secular. I mean, this was the thing in Austria. We don't want secular marriage. We don't want divorce. We don't want religious education out of the schools and so forth. We don't like these changes that are happening. We want to stop them. And there's a kind of reaction. And usually what happens, I mean, it doesn't mean it's always the case, but if you look at the way these things go, even these reactions, they never really succeed in the long run. And at the end, it's much worse. It's
Yeah.
much worse for and Hungary. I mean, we can see they followed Orban because he's so successful, but the problems in Hungary are getting worse and worse. Orban is
Yeah.
having more and more. Now he's got a serious domestic challenger, and when it ends, all of the problems that are unsolved in Hungary are going to just sort of like burst out like a boil or something, and
Yeah.
and the churches are going to be way worse off
Yeah.
than they used to be, and the society. I mean, in fact, we see even in Hungary that despite all the Christian nationalist rhetoric, the pace of secularization has not slowed down at all in Hungary.
If
Mhm.
there is to be an America worth conserving, it must be founded again, now explicitly in departure from the philosophic principles that animated its liberal founding, appropriating those structures and even the language of liberty and rights to build anew a civilization worthy of preservation, rather than embrace a conservatism that simply, if creatively, destroys inherited practice and ways of life. A second sailing is most needful, the refounding of an America worth conserving. It's from Conserving America.
That's from Deneen.
Yeah.
That one I haven't read. I didn't read that one.
I think I was maybe one of the only ones.
So, whatever. I mean, it's just like I don't see that. That to me, those don't look like, those are not serious. It's that you're not addressing. That's not a serious attempt to address whatever challenges we have in our society.
Yeah.
It's just a lot of it's just a lot of rhetoric.
It's 20,000 feet,
Yeah.
you know, in the air, and the closer you get to the ground, the more unpleasant the activities you have to do in order to realize it.
Yeah.
You know,
Right.
and you talked about the secularization of Hungary apace. It's also experiencing net migration out.
Yeah.
And
right. Oh, yeah. That's absolutely true.
And one of the reasons why, even if Orban didn't have a stranglehold over a lot of the processes there, he would continue to win, is they're the people who vote for him are the only ones who are staying.
Right.
So,
do you know why? Tell us this, since give us the inside scoop here. What's the deal with Orban and this axis of autocracy? Like, why does he always side with Putin? Why is he so friendly with the CCP? Or Maduro?
Well, okay, so why he's so friendly with Putin and Russia is hard to understand. I don't think everyone always doesn't. No one really understands it.
There's got to be some hidden back deal thing going on.
What could it be? Well, I mean, he could. It might just be at this point that Orban just believes his ideology about the decline of the West, and let's just say we're doing our best to make it seem like he's right. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
so he may just think that he just may believe that the West is on the way out, and Russia and the East is on the way up. So maybe that's what he thinks, and he's certainly himself an authoritarian, so he probably likes being around authoritarians. His relationship with China it's somewhat rational. This is I have because Hungary's a little country, and it needs to have an economy. All right. Basically, Europe, it does trade with China. It trades with China in any kind of green technologies. China's way ahead of Europe. So if you're concerned about the environment and you want to implement green technologies, you're going to have to do trade with China. And I just think it's a fact, although that we'll see what happens, that China will always be a presence in Europe. So if you're Hungary and you say, well, we want to make sure we are protecting our economy, we want to, then why not trade with China and become like Orban is trying to build, no one likes it, but he's building a battery factory in Eastern Hungary, to build batteries for whatever, electric vehicles, right? And it's supposedly bad I'm sure it's bad for the environment, and there's a lot of corruption connected with it, and it's not being transparent. I mean, many, many bad things about it, but is that really a bad idea to have a plant in Hungary that builds electric batteries, because Europe is shifting towards electric vehicles, right? So, and if you want to do that, you got the batteries come from China. So to some extent, it's not totally irrational it's not irrational. And it's even if you totally don't care, I mean, you could say, well, this is why Europe was always collecting gas from Russia as well. I mean, it's close and it's cheaper, right? So it's rational. It's accompanied by lots of corruption and lots of bad things, but it's not an irrational political strategy. What is hard to understand is why he has so it's cost him so much, his sort of pro-Putin, anti-Ukraine position. It's cost us so much within the European Union. It's cost him with the United States, although now that will no doubt change. But it's had a lot of political cost, and it's very hard to see what the gain is from it. It's hard to understand why he's doing that.
Yeah,
and I don't know the answer.
And then Maduro too. He was supportive of Maduro when he stole that last election.
Yeah, well, that's because that has to do something with Russia. So yeah.
Yeah, and then he also, and then he had that awkward encounter with Zelensky down in Argentina, where Zelensky got right up in his face.
Yeah,
that was pretty fun to watch for me.
Yeah. So he's basically on the side of the authoritarians. I mean, I think that's clear, and it's essentially an authoritarian country, which doesn't mean Orban can't be toppled, but
I hope he is soon.
He could be or not, but I mean, it's just not a. It's a hybrid regime where it's not a democracy. So.
Well, I forgot to mention early on that we are recording this on November 15th, our first post 2024 election. And we did pretty good not talking about that. We stayed on topic, gang. We did a good job. I want to thank Dr. Baer for H. David Baer, right? For appearing and talking about his great essay at the Bulwark, as well as letting us endlessly force him to speculate about people's motives here on the podcast. Don't forget to like and subscribe, hit the bell icon. We got to have you on here again to talk about the future of things once the dust has settled, because there's still so much going on. But again, thank you so much for coming on.
All right, thank you. It was fun.
Bye, everyone.